The glass display case didn't just crack. It exploded like a gunshot, spraying jagged diamonds of light across the linoleum and into the ruins of Jolin's cherry pies. As the mysterious woman fled into the freezing Appalachian night, leaving her child's handprint on the fogged window, Jolin reached for a forgotten wallet left on the counter. Her fingers didn't find a driver's license or a crumpled bill. Instead, she pulled out a single glossy photograph of her husband, the man who was supposed to be working a double shift at the coal plant, grinning in a designer suit, his arm wrapped around the very woman who had just shattered her diner. The heavy wall phone began to ring, a rhythmic, jarring assault that cut through the silence. When Jolin picked up, it wasn't her husband's voice on the other end, but a cold, mechanical stranger informing her that every brick of the diner and every inch of her home now belonged to a bank she had never heard of. Outside, the wind howled through the cracks in the walls, but the real chill was the realization that the life she had spent 30 years building wasn't a home. It was a stage set, and the curtains had just been ripped down. The bell above the door jingled, too sharp, too bright for this hour. Jolin didn't lift her head. Her fingers kept sorting the ones, the fives, the tens, each bill worn at the edges like the hem of an old coat. The new customer's boots scuffed against the linoleum, a slow drag of rubber on waxed floor. She recognized the rhythm before she saw the face. "You're still here," said a voice, rough as gravel under a tire. "Thought you'd have quit by now." Jolin exhaled through her nose, the sound lost beneath the hum of the fridge. She didn't answer. The man, Dale, his name was, slid onto the counter stool, the vinyl creaking under his weight. His hands, thick-knuckled and stained with something dark, tapped the counter once, twice. The scent of motor oil and stale cigarettes clung to him, sharp enough to cut through the grease of the grill. "Coffee," he said. Not a question, a demand. She reached for the pot without looking, the glass warm against her palm. The liquid poured in a thin, dark stream, the aroma bitter and familiar. Dale's fingers curled around the mug, leaving smudges on the rim. He didn't drink, just stared at the steam rising between them. "Heard about the layoffs," he said finally. Jolin's thumb pressed harder into the stack of bills. The paper bent, then sprang back. Outside, a car horn blared, distant and indifferent. "Not my problem," she said. Dale's laugh was a dry thing, like dead leaves skittering across pavement. "Ain't nobody's problem till it's yours." The clock above the grill ticked. The second hand jerked forward, relentless. Jolin wiped her hands on her apron, the fabric rough against her skin. The money in the register stayed neat. The world outside stayed loud, and Dale's coffee sat untouched, cooling between them. As Dale eventually shuffled out into the damp-welched night, leaving only a lingering ghost of tobacco, Jolin returned to the ritual of the count. Her fingers moved with a precision born of 30 years behind this counter. The dollar bills were soft as cloth, smelling of coal dust and sweat, the scent of this town. She smoothed a crumpled $5 bill against the wood. Wood. It had to be flat. Everything in the drawer had its place, nestled into narrow metal slots that clicked shut with a finality she found comforting. Order was the only thing that kept the creeping gray of West Virginia from leaking through the cracks in the walls. The light from the overhead lamps shimmered off the chrome of the espresso machine, a polished silver beast that stood as a monument to her hard work. She took a deep breath, the air thick with the ghost of fried bacon and the cloying sweetness of vanilla sugar from the morning's baking. This was her kingdom, small and weathered, but predictable. Safe. Safe. She grabbed a flannel rag, the fabric gray from 1,000 washings, and began to buff the laminate surface of the corner table. She moved in wide, rhythmic circles, watching her own reflection appear in the dark surface. She adjusted the lace doilies, aligning the corners until they sat perfectly centered. Her eyes drifted to the clock. Midnight neared. Frank would be home soon, driving the winding, treacherous road back from Bluefield. He was always working late these days, picking up the heavy overtime shifts at the plant that left him smelling of industrial grease and exhaustion. She moved to the windowsill, rearranging the small porcelain figurines, a collection of birds and shepherdesses that Frank had bought her over the years. She brushed away a speck of dust that wasn't even there. The thought of him pulling into the gravel lot, the headlights cutting through the Appalachian fog, brought a warmth to her chest that the radiator couldn't match. She smoothed the pleats of the curtains, ensuring the view was framed just right for his return. Then, the bells shrieked. It wasn't a gentle jingle this time. It was a frantic, metallic cry as the door was thrown open. A gust of November wind, icy and smelling of wet asphalt, tore through the diner, scattering the napkins she had just leveled. Jolin flinched, the flannel rag slipping from her fingers to the floor. A woman stood in the doorway, framed by the black maw of the night. She was young, far too young for the hollow look in her eyes, her skin a sickly, translucent white. Her fingers were white-knuckled, clamped around the hand of a small boy. The child couldn't have been more than 3, his blonde hair a mess of tangled silk, his superhero t-shirt far too thin for the biting cold. The woman's light coat was damp, clinging to her thin frame as she shivered under the fluorescent lights. "We're closed," Jolin started to say, but the words died in her throat. The woman looked hunted. The little boy suddenly lunged, breaking free from the woman's grasp with a burst of toddler energy. He stumbled toward the massive glass display case where the day's pies sat in silent, sugary rows. Jolin reached out, her heart leaping into her throat, but her hands grasped only empty air. The sound was like a gunshot. The glass shattered, a crystalline explosion that sprayed shards across the linoleum like diamonds cast into the mud. The boy let out a sharp, terrified wail. Jolin's signature cherry pies, the ones she had spent 3 hours braiding the crusts for, were now a ruin of red filling and jagged, transparent needles. The sweet aroma of cherries met the stale smell of street dust. "I'm sorry, oh God, I'm so sorry," the woman stammered, her voice a thin, brittle thread. She scooped the sobbing child into her arms, ignoring the glass crunching under her boots. "Wait," Jolin began, moving toward them, but the woman was already gone. The door slammed shut, the bell giving one final, pathetic tinkle. Jolin stood in the sudden silence, her breath hitching. She knelt among the wreckage, her knees pressing into the hard floor. She began to gather the larger pieces of glass into the hem of her apron, her movements mechanical. A sharp sting flared in her thumb, a bead of blood blossomed against the white fabric. But she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. As she reached for a shard near the leg of a chair, she saw it. A leather wallet worn at the edges, lying on the vinyl seat where the woman had briefly leaned. It was dark, heavy, and looked out of place against the diner's faded pastel palette. Jolin set the glass aside and stood, her legs feeling like lead. She picked up the wallet. The leather was still cold from the outside air. She flipped the latch. She expected to find a driver's license, an ID, something to tell her where to return it. Instead, her fingers brushed against a glossy rectangle of paper tucked into the billfold. She pulled it out. The world didn't stop, but it felt as though it had. The photograph was sharp, professional. There was Frank. Frank. He was grinning, a wide, easy smile she hadn't seen in a decade. He was wearing a suit, charcoal gray, expensive, a fabric she didn't recognize. His arm was draped possessively around the waist of the young woman who had just been standing in her diner. They were standing in front of a house in Bluefield, a grand white thing with columns and a lawn so green it looked painted. Jolin felt the air leave her lungs. The photo shook in her hand. This wasn't the tired man who came home complaining about the foreman and the broken machines. This was a man who looked like he owned the world. She looked at the wedding photo behind the register. Frank in his one good corduroy jacket, looking nervous and young. Then she looked back at the glossy print. The lie was a physical weight, a crushing pressure on her ribs. Every late night, every overtime shift, every cent he said was going toward the mortgage. It was all there, in the columns of that white house. The phone on the wall began to ring. The sound was a jarring, rhythmic assault. Jolin didn't move. She stared at Frank's face, at the way he held that girl. The phone rang again, and again. Her hand moved of its own accord, reaching for the receiver. She didn't say hello. She just listened to the static on the line. "Is this Jolin Harmon?" a man's voice asked. It was a cold voice, the kind used by people who deal in bad news and balance sheets. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes. This is the recovery department at Mid-Atlantic Holdings. We're calling regarding the delinquent status of your commercial and residential accounts. We've sent multiple notices, Mrs. Harmon. The grace period has expired." Jolin gripped the receiver until her knuckles turned white. "What accounts? We don't have accounts with you." "The lines of credit secured by the property at 42 Main Street and the residence on Sycamore," the voice continued, indifferent to her confusion. "The total outstanding balance, including penalties, is $64,000. Since the last 3 payments were returned for insufficient funds, we are initiating the foreclosure process immediately." "There's a mistake," Jolin said, her voice cracking. "My husband. He handles the banking. We're fine. Fine. The documents bear your husband's signature, Mrs. Harmon, and yours. Both properties were used as collateral for a private loan issued 18 months ago. The funds were dispersed to a secondary account in Bluefield." The room began to tilt. Jolene looked at the cozy booth she had scrubbed, the floor she had waxed, the life she had built. It wasn't hers. It was a ghost. Frank had taken their history and gambled it away on a life she didn't even know existed. He had turned her into a tenant in her own skin. She let the phone drop. It swung on its cord, the dial tone a repetitive, mocking beep. She sank into a wooden chair, the sound of glass crunching under her boots like the breaking of bones. She looked at the notification of eviction she hadn't noticed earlier, shoved under the door during the chaos. She walked to the window and pressed her forehead against the cold glass. Welch sat outside, a gray, dying thing smothered in coal dust. The fog was so thick she couldn't see the end of the street. She realized then that she wasn't waiting for Frank to come home. He had never been home. He had been a visitor, a thief who had stayed just long enough to take everything that wasn't nailed down. The morning didn't bring light, only a different shade of gray. Jolin didn't sleep. She spent the hours in the crawl space of the back office, her knees screaming against the concrete. She knew there was a safe, a small, fireproof box Frank had insisted on installing years ago for emergencies. Her fingers fumbled with the dial, the clicks sounding like heartbeats. When the door finally groaned open, she reached inside, her heart hammering against her ribs. She expected the stacks of cash they had saved for retirement, the emergency fund they had built dollar by dollar. She found a tin box for Danish butter cookies. It was empty. She ran her hand over the cold metal bottom. Nothing. Not a cent. The void was chilling, a physical manifestation of his betrayal. She moved to the desk, tearing open drawers, sending paperclips flying like shrapnel. Under a pile of old menus, she found a folder. The bank statements inside looked real at first glance. The logos were crisp, the columns of numbers promising a steady growth. But as she held a page up to the desk lamp, she saw the truth. The letters were slightly blurred, the alignment of the E and O off by a fraction of a millimeter. It was a cheap forgery. Frank had been printing his own reality, feeding her a diet of paper dreams while he bled her dry. She crumpled the sheet, the dry sound of the paper filling the small room. By noon, the diner was half full of miners seeking a reprieve from the damp cold. The smell of beef stew filled the air, but Jolin felt like an intruder in her own kitchen. The bell rang, not the frantic jingle of the night before, but a heavy, authoritative sound. Two men in charcoal overcoats entered. They didn't take off their hats. They didn't look at the menu. One of them pulled a roll of neon red tape from his pocket. The sound of it unspooling was a violent, sticky rip. Jolin watched, frozen with a ladle in her hand, as he slapped a jagged red cross across the front of her refrigerator. "What are you doing?" she managed to choke out. "Court order, ma'am," the man said, not looking at her. He moved to the register, sealing the drawer with the same blood-colored tape. "The contents of this building are now state property pending liquidation." The diner went silent. The clatter of forks stopped. Old Billy, a regular who had sat in the same stool since the Carter administration, stood up slowly. He didn't finish his stew. He didn't look at Jolin. He just grabbed his cap and shuffled out. One by one, the others followed, a grim procession of bowed heads. They didn't pay. They didn't say goodbye. In Welch, trouble was contagious, and no one wanted to catch it. Jolin stood in the center of her empty kingdom, the red tape glowing like a wound. Before she could even process the silence, a black SUV roared into the lot, spraying mud across the windows. A man named Buckley stepped out. He was a wall of a man, his face a map of broken veins and bad intentions. He didn't use the handle. He kicked the door, the glass rattling in its frame. "Where is he?" Buckley roared, his voice shaking the salt shakers. "He's not here," Jolin said, her voice small. Buckley didn't care. He swept a row of glasses off the counter with one thick arm, the sound of breaking glass a sickening echo of the night before. He leaned over the counter, the smell of stale beer and cheap tobacco rolling off him in waves. "Your husband owes me $50,000, lady. High-stakes poker isn't a charity. He stopped paying his vig 3 months ago." "I don't have it," she said, her back hitting the cold tile of the wall. Buckley grabbed her shoulder, his fingers digging into her skin with a bruising strength. "You tell him he has 24 hours. If I don't see the green, I'm coming back with a gallon of gas and a Zippo. I don't care if you're inside or not." He threw her back, her elbow catching the edge of a shelf. He left as quickly as he had come, the door swinging on its hinges. Jolin didn't cry. She couldn't. She felt hollowed out, a burnt-out husk of a woman. She reached for the phone, dialing Frank's number for the 100th time. "The number you have dialed is no longer in service." The mechanical voice was the final nail. He was gone. He had vanished into his white house in Bluefield, leaving her to face the fires he had lit. She walked to the door and turned the heavy iron bolt. The sound of metal on metal was the only thing she had left. Outside, the sky turned a bruised purple as the storm finally broke. Rain began to lash against the windows, a rhythmic, violent drumming. She stood in the dark, the electricity having been cut an hour ago. The red seized tape was the only thing that had color in the room. She felt the isolation like a physical weight, a wall of water and stone between her and the rest of the world. She was alone. and the fire was coming. The darkness in the diner was total, save for the rhythmic flash of a dying street lamp outside. Jolin sat on the floor, her back against the oven. She felt the cold of the linoleum seeping into her bones. Her mind was a kaleidoscope of betrayals, each turn revealing a new jagged edge. She struck a match. The small flame illuminated her hands, red, raw, and shaking. She lit a kerosene lamp, the yellow glow casting long, distorted shadows against the walls. In the flickering light, the diner looked like a shipwreck. She remembered the floorboard. Years ago, when they first bought the place, she had insisted on a hidden spot for the original deeds. Frank had laughed, calling her paranoid, but he had installed it anyway. She crawled to the back of the office, her fingers searching for the slight dip in the wood. Click. She pulled up the board. Inside was a thick manila envelope. She opened it, hoping for a miracle. Instead, she found the blueprints for her own execution. The documents were the original mortgage papers, but there were riders attached, recent ones. Frank had used her forged signature to take out a massive equity loan. But it wasn't for the diner. The destination of the funds was listed clearly. 114 Crestview Drive, Bluefield. The owner, Emily Walker. The young woman from the night before. Jolin stared at the name. Emily. It sounded soft, innocent. It sounded like the kind of name a man would leave his life for. Frank hadn't just cheated. He had built a parallel universe. He had bought a house, a life, a future, all using the bricks of Jolin's past. The sound of a car door slamming cut through the roar of the rain. Jolin froze. Heavy footsteps crunched on the gravel. The front door groaned, the wood straining against the bolt she had thrown. Then, a crash. The chain snapped, and the door swung open, hitting the wall with a sound like a thunderclap. Frank stood there. He was drenched, his coat heavy with water, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked older, his face a mask of exhaustion and something sharper. Desperation. He didn't look like the man in the photo. He looked like a cornered animal. "Where is it?" he rasped, not even looking at her. He began tearing through the drawers of the register. "I know you found the wallet, Jolin. Give me the papers." "You sold us, Frank," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "You sold me for a girl who isn't even old enough to remember the Reagan administration." Frank stopped. He turned to her, his eyes narrowed. The guilt lasted for a second before it was replaced by a cold, hard anger. "You don't understand," he said, stepping toward her. "Welch is a graveyard, Jolin. I was suffocating here, with you. Always the same stories, the same smells, the same gray sky. Emily, she's life. She's a chance to start over. With my money, my diner." "It's our diner," he spat. He reached for her, his hands grabbing her arms. "Give me the folder, Jolin. I can still fix this. I can get Buckley off our backs if I can just leverage the Bluefield property." "You're lying," she said, twisting in his grip. "You're going to take what's left and run to her." He shoved her, hard. Jolin flew backward, her spine hitting the massive iron stove. The pilot light was still on, and the metal was searingly hot. She screamed as the heat bit through her shirt, the smell of singed fabric filling the air. Frank didn't flinch. He pinned her there, his weight crushing her against the burning metal. "You're an old woman, Jolin. You're a relic of a town that's already dead. Give me the papers, or I swear to God, I'll take them from your cold hands." The pain in her back was a white-hot scream, but it was nothing compared to the cold clarity that washed over her. The man holding her wasn't her husband. He was a predator. He was the fire Buckley had promised. "No," she whispered. He raised his hand. His fist clenched. The man who had promised to cherish her was gone. In his place was a thief who was willing to kill for a second chance. But Jolin Harmon was done being a victim. As Frank's hand began its descent, Jolin's fingers found the handle of the heavy cast-iron skillet sitting on the back burner. She didn't think. She swung. The sound of iron meeting bone was dull and final. Frank tumbled back, his hand clutching his jaw, his eyes wide with shock. Jolin stood up, the pain in her back a pulsing roar. She didn't stop. She reached under the counter and pulled out the long, serrated bread knife. The steel caught the light of the kerosene lamp, a jagged, silver warning. "One more step, Frank," she said, her voice as cold as the November rain. "And I'll show you exactly how much life I have left in me." Frank stared at her, the blood trickling from his lip. He saw it then. The woman he had underestimated for 30 years was gone. In her place stood someone he didn't recognize, someone who had nothing left to lose. The silence in the diner was thick enough to choke on. Frank stayed slumped against a booth, his hand still cradling his shattered jaw, his breathing a ragged, wet sound. He looked at the knife in Jolin's hand, then at her eyes. He didn't see the wife who had kept his dinner warm for 3 decades. He saw a stranger holding a blade. Jolin didn't lower the knife. The tip of the serrated steel trembled slightly, but her gaze was a fixed point. "You're going to sign the papers, Frank." "Yes, Jolin. Be reasonable." "Reasonable?" She laughed, a short, jagged sound that had no humor in it. "I've been reasonable for 20 years while you built a life in the shadows. I've been reasonable while you forged my name and sold the roof over my head. We are past reasonable." She reached into her apron and pulled out a fresh manila envelope. Not the one with the deeds, but the one she had stayed up until dawn preparing. Inside were photocopies of every forged signature, every suspicious bank transfer, and the photos from the wallet. "I've already made 3 copies, she said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "One goes to Sheriff Roberts, one goes to the district attorney in Bluefield, and the third? The third goes to the corporate board at the plant. I wonder what they'll think of their man of the year when they see the fraud charges." Frank's face went from pale to a sickly mottled gray. "You wouldn't. Try me. I have nothing left. You made sure of that. I'll go to jail with you if it means I get to watch the look on Emily's face when the police pull you out of that White House in handcuffs." The mention of the girl seemed to break him. The defiance drained out of his shoulders, leaving him looking small and hollow. He was a man who lived on the oxygen of his own reputation. Without it, he was nothing but a common thief. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice cracking. "Everything," she said. She cleared a space on the counter, sweeping a pile of napkins and a salt shaker to the floor. She laid out a single sheet of paper, a quitclaim deed, prepared by the town's only notary who owed her a favor for 10 years of free coffee. "You sign over the diner. You sign over the house on Sycamore. You sign over the remaining equity in the Bluefield property to cover the debts here. And then you leave. You don't go to the house. You don't take your clothes. You just walk out that door and you never come back to Welch." Frank looked at the pen she slid across the counter. He looked at the knife. "I have nowhere to go," he whispered. "Go to her," Jolin said, her heart hardening into a stone. "Go see if she still loves you when you're penniless and facing a felony warrant. See if that new life is as bright as you thought it was." With a hand that shook like a leaf in a gale, Frank picked up the pen. The scratch of the nib against the paper was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic, scratching death knell for their marriage. He pushed the paper back toward her, his eyes wet. "Jolin, get out," she said. She didn't look at him. She couldn't. If she saw the man she used to love, she might break, and she couldn't afford to break. Not yet. Frank stood up slowly. He walked to the door, his shadow long and distorted on the floor. He paused at the threshold, the rain misting his face. He looked back once, but Jolin was already turning away, her eyes fixed on the red, seized tape on the register. The door closed. The bell gave one final, dull jingle. Jolin stood alone in the dark. She let the knife clatter onto the counter. Her legs gave out, and she sank to the floor, her back screaming in protest against the burn. She sat among the glass and the dust, and for the first time in 48 hours, she wept. Not for Frank, not for the diner. She wept for the girl she had been, the one who had believed in the safety of a silver ring and a shared name. The sun rose over Welch the next morning, but it didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a beginning. Jolin was on the sidewalk before the first coal trucks rumbled through town. She had a ladder, a bucket of white paint, and a heavy iron crowbar. She climbed the ladder and hooked the crowbar under the edge of the Jolin's Diner sign. With a grunt of effort, she pulled. The rusted nails groaned, then gave way. The sign fell to the pavement with a heavy thud, the faded red paint chipping away. She didn't replace it with a new one. Not yet. Instead, she walked to the front window. She took a scraper and began to peel away the red, seized tape. It came off in jagged strips, leaving sticky residue on the glass. She scrubbed until her knuckles bled, until the glass was clear enough to see the ghost of her own reflection. A shadow fell over her. It was Peggy, her hair slightly mussed, a look of tentative hope on her face. She was carrying a box of cleaning supplies and a thermos. "I heard he left," Peggy said softly. Jolin didn't stop scrubbing. "He didn't leave. I threw him out." Peggy nodded, a slow, understanding movement. She set the box down and grabbed a rag. She didn't ask for permission. She just started on the other side of the window. "The town's talking, Jolin," Peggy said after a moment. "They say you're crazy for staying. Say the bank's going to take it all anyway." "Let them talk," Jolin said, her voice firm. "I've got the deeds. I've got a plan to sell the espresso machine and the industrial freezer to a place in Charleston. It'll cover the first 2 months of the back taxes." "And then what?" Jolin stopped. She looked at the empty space where the sign had been. She looked at the quiet gray street of Welch. "And then I'm going to open the doors," she said. "But not for burgers and fries. There are too many women in this town with bruises they can't explain and bank accounts they can't touch. This place is going to be for them. A place to sit, a place to think, a place to find their own knives." Peggy smiled, a small, genuine thing. "I like the sound of that." By noon, the seized tape was gone. The glass was clear. Jolin stood on the threshold, her back straight despite the bandages under her shirt. She looked out at the Appalachian hills, the mist clinging to the trees like a shroud. She had lost her husband. She had lost her savings. She had lost the life she thought she knew. But as she took a deep breath of the cold, crisp air, she realized she had found something better. She had found the woman who had been buried under 30 years of lace doilies and forged smiles. Jolin Harmon turned back into the diner and began to work. There was much to be done, and for the first time in her life, she was the only one holding the keys.